to some dare call it conspiracy. The Downfall of Richard D. Hall, Part 1, with Brent Lee, Neil Sanders, and Joe Hill. Today, a special report on the recent legal victory against Richard D. Hall, who falsely claimed the Manchester Arena attack was a hoax. Keen initiates will know, we often go searching for a specific moment in time when a conspiracy theory is born. But in this episode, we found the moment in time that a conspiracy theorist was born. Now let's explore Hall's transformation from skeptic to staunch advocate of hoax conspiracy theories, examining how he came to believe and later promote these harmful narratives. If you don't know much about this conspiracy theory, don't worry, we'll walk through some of it here. But if you want to know more, do listen to our Manchester Arena on Trial series. Now, let's discover where the truth lies.
So, just yesterday, as of recording, was the completion of Richard D. Hall's trial. Now, for people that don't know, he was being sued by Eve and Martin Hibbert for his book and film, The Night of the Bang, in which his contention was that the Manchester bombing, in which 22 people were killed, didn't really happen, that it was a piece of elaborate street theatre, and that all the people involved were actors, including Eve and Martin. He didn't believe that they received their injuries at that event. He even went so far as to doubt that they were father and daughter. But let's have a look and see what Richard's been up to, because a lot of people don't know what happened since the film came out up until the trial. They don't know what happened with the trial, and they also don't know what happened prior to his book coming out, how Richard became indoctrinated into the concept of crisis actors and everything being a hoax. Now, this has been going on for a long time. Brent and I were involved with the Panorama BBC program that was actually a couple of years ago now. And on that program, I made a statement that apparently caused a huge amount of fuss within the conspiracy world, that Richard did not used to believe in the concept of crisis actors or hoaxers, that he thought the whole thing was nonsense. And apparently that caused a big stir because he changed his mind, Neil, when he found evidence, which is whether that's the case or not, we'll find out as we go along. So just so that people understand exactly what it means, is that his theory was that the Manchester bombing did not happen. Nobody was killed there. There wasn't a bombing that happened. It was an elaborate piece of street theatre arranged by the government and all the intelligence agencies. It's never really clear who or why, for reasons which include basically a war on terror.
And of course, you can listen to our complete debunk of that, featuring, of course, our guest today, Joel Hill.
I must say, trigger warning, it is fucking painful to listen to, because when it comes down to it, listening to talking about getting kids killed is never fun. But when it comes to this weird bubble, this ecosystem of conspiratorial thought in the UK, this needs debunking more than anything I can really think of in the immediate term, because the idea that you could call this a false flag is despicable. And it's been, well, let's go through it. Right, I'm not going to make any judgments that the court hasn't made.
That was why we had to do that series as well, was because one of Richard's contentions was that nobody had actually looked at his evidence, that he had very, very compelling evidence that the whole thing was fake and a hoax, and that people didn't die. And so we examined the entire thing. We looked at his book, we looked at his film, we looked at several interviews that he did surrounding the topic. And I don't want to spoil anything, but we found that he was completely wrong. And we found huge holes in his theory, and actually things that completely disproved his theory. So please do go and listen to that. So how did Richard start to get into this? Well, for people that don't know, Richard is a conspiracy theorist / investigative journalist, self-proclaimed, who has a TV show that used to be on a very sort of fringe Sky channel, and he now broadcasts it through the internet, called Rich Planet TV. And basically, he's the host. He interviews people about UFOs, the paranormal, conspiracy theories, and such like that. Now, he'd been doing this for a few years, and the first major incident that sort of informed this entire genre was on the 14th of December 2012, which was the Sandy Hook school shooting. And this was a horrible, horrible event where a boy called Adam Lanza took a gun to school and killed 26 people, including 20 children. Some of these children were incredibly young. And for some reason, almost immediately, there was a couple of people that started saying that this was a hoax and looking at the video footage and claiming that the entire thing was elaborate street theatre and no children died. And one of these people was a gentleman called Jim Fetzer. He wrote a book called Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. Jim Fetzer is essentially a con man and a Holocaust denier. The other major player was a man called Wolfgang Halbig, who pretended to be a school safety expert and insinuated that he used to be a policeman, neither of which were true. And he also, by examining the footage, had decided that everything was fake. Now, with Sandy Hook, what happened? Ultimately, a lot of people will know about this because of Alex Jones. Alex Jones promoted this theory that everything was fake, phony as a $3 bill. It took him a long time to come to this realization. I'm quoting Alex Jones, but nobody died there. It was completely synthetic. And he was sued by parents of the children. And ultimately, it cost him over $1 billion. So the people may well be aware of that. But on the 23rd of January 2013, Rich Planet broadcast an episode with Nick Colostrom. Nick is a friend of Richard's. He's an ex-academic. He's always has a slightly befuddled look on his face. This show was titled State-Sponsored Terrorism and Sandy Hook Shootings. And Nick says that he was exposed to the idea that Sandy Hook was completely fake by none other than Jim Fetzer. So Jim Fetzer was the seed for the concept that Sandy Hook was fake, and that ultimately led to the downfall of Alex Jones, or at least the suing of Alex Jones. Jim Fetzer is the person that told Nick Colostrom that Sandy Hook was fake, and Nick Colostrom is the person that would ultimately convince Richard D. Hall that Manchester and other events were fake, culminating in Richard being sued. So the linchpin on both of these prominent conspiracy theorists ultimately being sued in court was Jim Fetzer. Now, apparently, Jim Fetzer founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth with a man called Stephen Jones, and he thinks all sorts of things are fake. He thinks that the Zapruder film is fake. He thinks that Paul McCartney was replaced in 1966. He thinks that Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, the Parkland shooting, the moon landings, obviously, and the death of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, and also the Pulse nightclub shooting. Jim Fetzer thinks all of those events were fake, and he's also a Holocaust denier. And in 2015, he published a book co-written with Mike Palachuk titled Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. It was a FEMA drill to promote gun control. And in 2019, Jim Fetzer was sued for $450,000 successfully by Leonard Posner, whose son Noah was sadly killed at Sandy Hook. So, in this episode, Nick is explaining to Richard that Sandy Hook was fake. And some of these themes are going to become the bread and butter of Richard's theory as we go along. Because Nick's main concern is that he hasn't actually seen any photographs of dead children. And that's why he thinks that Sandy Hook might be fake. Now, interestingly, we know now that that was one of Richard's main sort of bits of evidence, that the Manchester bombing was fake. But back many, many years ago, Richard counters that, of course, they won't show pictures of dead children. That would be far too sensitive to show. Nick then says, well, you can't have a murder without a body, and that's not actually true. There's a very famous case, John Haig, the acid bath murderer, who misunderstood the concept of a body of evidence and felt that he could get away with murders because he'd basically dissolved people in acid. And he admitted to these murders, and even though they didn't have the body because of he was still convicted. So anyway, but Richard just accepts this and just moves on. But there is a very interesting interchange. Nicholas says
that they cannot show any dead bodies. That's the weird feature about this.
To play devil's advocate, these are children and they've been killed. So therefore, is that not sensitive to put that out on the news? Is that why they may not have shown the actual dead bodies, Nick? Just to put that point to you.
Well, my reply to that is, to have a murder case, you have to have a dead body.
Later in the show, Richard says,
Let's just consider the evidence then, Nick. So we've got no video, the authorities have put no video evidence out showing that anyone was even killed or even a gun was fired.
Right, right.
There's no photographic evidence. There's everyone who was shot apart from one or two
There's
people.
no blood anywhere.
Right.
No real blood.
and that is again a line that Richard would use in the future when talking about Manchester. On the show, they then decide to laugh at Robbie Parker. Robbie Parker is a gentleman whose daughter's died at Sandy Hook, and he very nervously sort of has a little smile as he's trying to speak to the public, which is a very, very natural response to a stress situation. And this has been picked up by conspiracy theorists and pulled over as absolute evidence that this man is acting and that his daughters didn't die. And this is actually, again, the precursor to Richard's evidence, in inverted commas, that Nick Bickerstaff, who was wandering around the arena trying to find his daughter, was not realistic in his grief. Because obviously Richard is an expert on all of these things and such. And so you can see the seeds of this theory start to come about. They do talk about crisisactors.org, and they say that basically they provide actors. And then Nick Collerstrom says that it was very clear that some of the people who were supposedly the walking wounded and the injured at 7/7 obviously have fake injuries, which is not something that he's proved. Also, there's a lovely picture of me promoting my book in this episode, which is nice. So, you know, for the win. There is an interesting point that struck me, is that they keep talking, and even in Richard's film, they talk about using crisisactors.org or organizations that have crisis actors within them. He even shows at the beginning of his film them doing the drill at a shopping centre, and basically says, look, these organisations exist. And yes, they do exist. They provide training for the army, the military and stuff like that. But here's a flaw with that we didn't point out on our show. None of the people involved were from that organisation. Richard's contention is that all the people were civilians that were tapped up by MI5. And so, again, this is something that, on close scrutiny, just the fact that crisisactors.org exists doesn't prove anything, and it actually somewhat goes against your theory. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, they consulted with them and stuff like that. It's like, well, then why not use their own people? Why would they have to use members of the public? It's just one of these things that basically means that his theory doesn't really hold that much water at all when you hold it up to any scrutiny at all. So, who is Nick Collerstrom? Right, because Nick is an important person in this tale. Nick's a historian of science. He got his Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science in 1968 from Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and he got a PhD in the history of science from University College London in 1995. So he's no slouch academically. According to his book Lead on the Brain, he worked from 1971 to 1976 for the Medical Research Council's Air Pollution Research Unit in London, and later as a physics and mathematics teacher. Interestingly, he's now a climate change denialist, obviously. And he was supportive of the view that gardening by the lunar cycle affects plant growth, and this is known as lunar gardening. And he apparently worked on a biodynamic farm in the 1970s, so a bit eclectic even when he was in academia. In 1990, Collerstrom was elected a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and in 1994 he was awarded a PhD by University College London for a thesis entitled The Achievement of Newton's Theory of the Moon's Motion of 1702. Actually, now I also think that he denies that the moon landing ever happened, which, we can see. He was also awarded a Leverhulme Scholarship and an honorary postdoctoral research fellowship at UCL's Department of Science and Technology Studies. And his book, Newton's Forgotten Lunar Theory, his contribution to the quest for longitude, was published in 2000. Collerstrom was also active in political campaigns in the UK throughout the 1980s, and in 1985 he co-founded the London Nuclear Warfare Tribunal, which sought to question the legality of nuclear weapons. Now conspiracy theorists think that nuclear weapons are fake. So, we've come a long way. The following year, he became a founding member of the Belgrano Action Group, set up in protest at the sinking of the Argentine ship, the ARA General Belgrano, by the Royal Navy during the 1982 Falklands War. And in 1989, Colostrum stood as a Green Party candidate for East Guildford in the Surrey County Council elections. So bit of a lefty, bit of a sort of anti-war kind of guy, because in 2002, in the run-up to the Iraq War, he became a founding member of the Legal Inquiry Steering Group, a citizens' tribunal in the UK that challenged the legality of the war. In 2006, he appeared in a video by David Shaler, who some of us know, supporting a fringe conspiracy theory that the men accused of the 7/7 bombings in London had not actually carried out the attack. And he published a book called Terror on the Tube, Behind the Veil of 7/7. And he was also featured and quite roundly mocked, actually, on the BBC on a series called The Conspiracy Files. Now, in 2007, so this is before Richard's met him, this is before I met Nick, this is before anybody really knew who Nick was. In 2007, on the website for the Committee of Open Debate on the Holocaust, which is a Holocaust denial group, Colostrum argued for a fringe view that the gas chambers in the Auschwitz concentration camp had actually only been used for disinfection purposes, and that only 1 million Jews died in the war. And this is based on a plaque at Auschwitz that was altered by the Russians, and the work of Frederick Leuchter, who was later completely discredited because it turned out he was lying about everything, including his credentials as a gas chamber engineer. He really wasn't qualified at all. Anyway, in March 2008, on a second article on the same website, he alleged that Auschwitz had actually been really rather nice, and that they had art classes, they had a well-stocked library for inmates, they had a swimming pool where the inmates would frolic and sunbathe on weekends whilst watching water polo matches. David Aronovich, who was writing for the Jewish Chronicle, called this one of the most jaw-dropping pieces of insulting stupidity that he had ever seen. And UCL removed Colostrum's honorary fellowship in April 2008 when the articles were brought to their attention. Now, it wasn't until 2011 that Colostrum first appeared on Rich Planet to discuss his theory on the 7/7 bombing, and he and Richard are actually really good friends. He's appeared on Rich Planet 14 times. I have to be honest, I ain't know he was a Holocaust denier when I met him. He for whatever reason, kept that a bit under the radar. At least for a bit, because in 2014, Colostrum published the book Breaking the Spell, The Holocaust, Myth and Reality, and this was published by Castle Hill, which was Gerner Rudolph's Holocaust Denial printing press, which was based in Sussex. And it was had a foreword from self-described Holocaust denier and Sandy Hook denialist Jim Fetzer, who also founded 9/11 Scholars for Truth. Now, this book is no longer available on Amazon. It was removed in 2017. Not content with denying the Holocaust, in 2015, he released his book, The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966, a very English mystery, suggesting that Paul McCartney was dead and had been replaced by a lookalike. So, as we can see, Nick is a wacky character. That's one way of putting it. He is very sort of suspicious of events that have happened throughout the world, and tends to think that everything is fake. It is an interesting thing that he's a Holocaust denier, and that nobody seemed to have a problem with that. But that's probably a discussion for another show. Anyway, moving on. On the 15th of April 2013, the Boston Marathon bombing happens, and the brothers Tamarlan and Dozikar Sarnev planted 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs that were detonated near the finish line of the race. 3 people were killed and hundreds were injured, including 17 people who lost limbs. Very, very shortly after this, people started saying that things looked a bit fishy. Not qualified people. There was a very famous bit of footage of a man who'd lost his legs being sort of taken away, and you can actually see the person holding what appears to be his artery to stop it from bleeding. Now, at the time, everybody said that this was obviously Hollywood special effects and stuff like that, because they know. I, at the time, asked a paramedic that I knew whether he'd ever seen anything like that, whether people could survive with legs blown off, whether holding an artery like that would be the correct way to help somebody in that situation. And he says, "Oh yeah, absolutely. I've seen that happen. I've seen far worse than that. I've seen situations where you would be astonished that people were still alive, like people literally cut in half by lorries and stuff like that. Sometimes the body can be far more resilient." The long and short of it was that he, an expert that had been in situations similar to that, saw nothing suspicious. But the internet had a different argument, that they did find something suspicious in that. Everything suspicious. The entire thing was fake. Well, on the 22nd of May 2013, British Army soldier Fusilier Lee Rigby of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers was attacked and killed by Islamist terrorists Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale near the Royal Artillery Barracks in Woolwich, southeast London. He was hit with a car and then stabbed and hacked to death with meat cleavers. Now, the reason that people immediately jumped on this as being potentially fake is even sillier than you would imagine. They noticed that on the pictures, we have in the UK double yellow lines next to the roads, which means you can't park there. Now, they noticed that in this picture, the double yellow lines were red, which meant that the newspapers had altered the imagery in order to make it look like there was blood where there was no blood. Now, if you know anything about English roads, sometimes we do have double red lines. That means you absolutely do not park there ever, ever, ever. In no circumstances at all, whereas there are some circumstances where certain people could be allowed to stay for a short time in double yellow lines. So the whole reason that people thought this was a fake was due to a misunderstanding about road markings in the UK by people in the UK, which is, it's on the thicker edge of stupid. But anyway, let's carry on. On the 14th of June 2013, Nick Colostrom appears again with a show titled Woolwich Fake Terror, UFO Citizens Hearings, which is obviously not connected to the Woolwich bit, and he suggests that the killing of Lee Rigby was staged and that no one really died. And if we look at how quickly he's come to that conclusion, that's pretty sharpish, right? That's the following month. So this person was killed on the 22nd of May, and on the 14th of June, Nick has got a presentation that he's willing to put on television where he knows that it's fake. Richard Hall says,
I'm joined today by Nick Colostrom, and I'm in London, and we're going to be talking about the incident which took place in Woolwich on the 22nd of May 2013, which strangely took place at 2:20 p.m. There was 2 perpetrators involved. One of them was aged 22, and they were called Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebolawe, just by coincidence. Okay.
So the 22, Richard has decided that for some reason the fact that there's a lot of 2s involved in this incident is suspicious, and that was something that was then put into the Manchester theory, because there was a lot of 22s that happened there. There's 22 people who were dead. One person had 22 wounds. I believe the killer was 22 at the time. There was lots of 22s. There is a reason. It's because there's only really sort of 9 numbers that we use over and over again in different combinations and such like that. So you're bound to see the same number a lot. Like, there's 2 2s in today's day, for Christ's sake, and an 11, which looks like a 2 in Roman numerals. So that's obviously very powerful evidence of something. So Nick says that everyone involved in the Lee Rigby incident were actors and that no real deaths occurred. But he does actually then say that, well, actually, maybe Lee Rigby was already dead. And so they had his corpse in the back of a van and simply dumped it on the road to use as a prop. Richard, his main concern is that there are no really good photos of a decapitated corpse. What this is that basically Lee Rigby, the early suggestion said that they'd cut off his head, which was obviously sort of connected to some other Islamic terror incidents at the time. They didn't cut off his head. They tried to cut off his head. And that sort of was picked up on and said, like, we didn't see a beheaded corpse. We didn't see his decapitated head in the press. And it's, well, no, you wouldn't really, though, would you? But again, that was apparently enough to get their spidey senses tingling. They also both suggest that there isn't really enough blood at the scene because they incorrectly say if you hack someone's head off, all 8 pints of blood would be either on the pavement. And it's like, it's not a Kurosawa film. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, it doesn't work like that. Anyway, on the 7th of January 2015, the magazine Charlie Hebdo was attacked by 2 gunmen who killed 12 people. The following day, a policeman and a man jogging were fatally shot. And on the 9th, the gunman held several hostages in a kosher supermarket, and 4 of these people were killed. On the 13th of November in 2015, the Paris attacks happened. There were 6 attacks, including 2 suicide bomb attacks and 4 shootings. One of the shootings was at the Bataclan Theatre, where the Eagles of Death Metal were playing a gig. 90 people were killed there. 138 died in total, including the 7 terrorists, and over 400 people were injured. On the 24th of November 2015, Jim Fetzer publishes the book Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. It was a FEMA drill to promote gun control, which argued that the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting never happened. In 2013, he published an article on Veterans Today titled, "Did Mossad Death Squads Slaughter American Children at Sandy Hook?" So Jim Fetzer had, for some reason, changed his mind. His initial thought was that, Mossad had killed these children. Realizing that was probably a bit silly, he abandoned that theory and picked another one. Anyway, on the 3rd of June 2016, Richard broadcasts a live talk titled Madeline, the EU, News, Subversion, LGBT, Hawking. And in this, he says a number of things, but the thing that I came away with is that he starts promoting the theory put forward by noted internet idiot Miles Mathis that Stephen Hawking's, the noted mathematician, had actually died years ago and had been replaced by an actor for reasons. Anybody got any thoughts on that? It is a difficult one, isn't it?
I don't think
so. No, because his reasoning behind this was that basically, if we replace Stephen Hawking, we can get him to say anything, and the world of science will go along with that, which misunderstands a number of things. Most of all, science, because that's not how science works, right? Okay,
it's not a hypothesis.
Well, if Stephen Hawking said, "Oh, you could, if you run fast enough, you can go through walls like those kids do in Harry Potter," scientists wouldn't go, "Oh, amazing, that guy's a genius." They would probably try it or ask for some sort of evidence.
Which would be very funny, because you'd see scientists trying to run into walls, which is great.
In fact, the only one that would be safe would be Stephen Hawking's, because I don't think his wheelchair can get enough speed up. And so he'd probably be okay.
I think that's right. To be honest, quite a troll.
No, that is exactly how science works. Like he was the king of science. King was in his name, so he was the king of science. Whatever he said, that's how all scientists now have to believe exactly what he said. That's how science works.
Makes sense.
That is how science works. Sounds like a deity to me, but look, I'm not qualified to judge.
His main 2 bits of evidence are that nobody else with multiple sclerosis has lived that long, and that if you look at Stephen Hawking's teeth, they look like they've changed over the years. Now, he hasn't bothered to find out whether Stephen Hawking has had dentures fitted or any number of things that could have been done to his teeth. But he has noted that over the span of 40-odd years, they do look slightly different, which is evidence of a type. Anyway, so now interestingly, still at this point, Richard doesn't believe in the hoax theory. He still doesn't. He's not on board with that. But we'll come on to that. So, on the 16th of June 2016, the MP Jo Cox is murdered outside her constituency surgery in the town of Birstall, and she was stabbed and shot by a man called Thomas Mayer, who shouted "Britain first" as he attacked her. Mayer was reportedly a white supremacist who was fascinated with Nazi Germany and apartheid-era South Africa. He also had links to the USA neo-Nazi group National Alliance. On the 1st of July 2016, Nick appears again with a show called Jo Cox, Paris Attacks, Fabricated Terror, and Auschwitz. So, yeah, it's definitely a show. And Richard questions what terror events might be fake and wonders if MP Jo Cox was or wasn't really murdered. And Richard's theory on this is that Jo Cox was connected to the White Helmets in Syria. Now, due to this lying journalist called Eva Bartlett, there's a theory that the White Helmets, who were basically a charity organization that were helping people dig people out of the rubble and get medical attention after their president was trying to murder them. Basically, there's these three photos of this little girl wearing pajamas, and if you notice the three pictures, she's being carried by three different men. And Ava Bartlett put out this theory that this proved that the entire thing was fake, that nobody had died from gas attacks, that Assad wasn't murdering his own civilians with the help of Russia because of these three pictures that showed that this girl had been taken to three different bomb sites and used as a prop. Now, if you actually bothered to look into it, it was the same bomb site, and she was just passed between three different people on the way to the ambulance. It really was as simple as that. But that it was enough for people to believe that the entire thing was fake, and for them to get on the side of not one, but two despotic dictators, Putin and Assad. And Richard actually says in this program that he thinks that Assad's been framed and that there's no killings of civilians in Syria. Also, Jo Cox wrote to the Nobel Committee suggesting that the White Helmets should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was opposed to Assad murdering his own civilians. And Richard finds that rather suspicious. So he says that although 9/11 and 7/7 were fabricated, people died, meaning that what he thinks is that the supposed method and the perpetrators are not as reported, but there were real casualties. But now he's starting to think that more and more attacks are happening where everything is fake and no one dies. And he suggests that the murder of Lee Rigby had no real victims, but he's not entirely sure. He says that it's possible that no one died at Sandy Hook, but he's not 100% sure about that either. And he says it is also possible that no one was killed in the Charlie Hebdo shooting or the Paris attacks, including the Bataclan shooting. And Richard says,
people claim that in some of the more recent terror attack cases, due to the lack of evidence of blood and because the witnesses or families are not reacting as expected, there is little evidence that anyone has died, even though the media report the deaths. Some claim that crisis actors are involved. There is little doubt in my mind that many of the terror attacks we see, just like 9/11 and 7/7, have fake perpetrators and some of them fake method. But I'm undecided about whether any of them have fake victims. Dr. Nick Colostrom, who I speak to in today's interview, seems convinced that the victims in some of the more recent terror attacks are fake. My hypothesis is that those who fabricate these events are attempting to mislead people. Not the 99% who buy the official story, but trying to mislead those who look further. Are they instructing the media by using the excuse of not offending people to show very little evidence of the deaths in media reports, with an ulterior motive to mislead truth seekers.
So what's fascinating there is that he's saying that he's not convinced by any of these theories. He's saying he's totally not convinced by anything Nick's told him. He's being polite. He's come up with a middle ground there of saying, well, Nick, I think you're an idiot, basically, but perhaps here's a reason that you're not an idiot, even though I think that you're wrong. And, that's interesting, because basically that is something that actually speaks to why he becomes indoctrinated in this, because you're in a family in the conspiracy world. That has become taken to absolutely hyper now, to the point where there's a party line. If you don't believe this and this and this and this, then you're suspicious and you're a shill. And we can see, even relatively recently, there were areas where people disagreed. They disagreed, as you can see, in quite cordial ways. In fact, even trying to say, even though I think you're wrong, here's a reason why you could still be wrong and right at the same time. And you just don't get that anymore. But it is fascinating to see that at this point, Richard wasn't really on board with everything is a hoax. He goes on to say,
in the case of Joe Cox, people were gobsmacked at Joe Cox's family continually smiling throughout the public statement given by Joe Cox's sister, and people pointed to the lack of blood or any physical evidence of a death in the media, raising questions over whether a death had even occurred. I ask the question, were the family given coaching to help them cope with being in the public eye? And were the media ordered not to show any blood? Is this done to mislead those who question the official story so they come to a more outrageous conclusion that the murder never even happened?
And again, we can start to see the seeds of Richard being sort of like, kind of, for want of a better phrase, groomed into the possibilities that these things might be there. And he's totally ignoring his previous advice, basically, that, well, of course they wouldn't show blood. And of course they wouldn't show that. Why would they? In fact, in Manchester, one of his main arguments is he lies. He says, I saw a picture in the newspaper of somebody that was involved in the Omaha bombing, and they had a bone sticking out of their leg. And I searched and I found that photograph, and it was from a science paper. It was never published in the newspaper. That's him misremembering that, or him misunderstanding the picture that he's seen. So no, they didn't used to show people and dead children and stuff like that. In very, very extreme circumstances, like the poor child that drowned, the refugee, they will show stuff like that. Occasionally you'll show it in regards to sort of like bombings in Gaza and such like that. But they don't tend to, because unless it is to make an incredibly powerful point. And in all of these situations, showing blood, showing gore would not make any point. It would simply be sensationalism. You don't need it for the story. The story is horrible enough without that level of graphic material. It's just, it would, in fact, if that had happened, if after Manchester or Sandy Hook had showed, they would have showed a picture of a dead child, people would have been horrified. This is why they tend to show sort of like images that sort of, this is the famous concept. We won't show a dead body, but we'll show a charred child's toy or a single child's shoe or something. Because you don't show dead bodies on the news. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But anyway, what's interesting, though, is at this point, Richard actually thinks that Joe Cox was murdered. He doesn't necessarily think that it was Thomas Mayer that did it, and he doesn't know what the motive was, but he does think that she was actually murdered. That will change as time goes on. And Richard asks Nick Kollerstrom,
just give us your definition of fabricated terror. How would you define it?
It's a strange feature of this 21st century that the state wants to arrange simulated events to scare the hell out of the population, and it seems to be in order to warrant and justify wars. Mm-hmm. And they seem to be confident they can get away with it, and we've had quite a few of these recently. Mm-hmm. But the big difference is it nowadays just done by actors with actors claiming to have fake blood on them and so on, or, as we saw earlier, in work you and I have done earlier with the London bombings, where you get a whole lot of people really killed.
Really killed in a fabricated event.
Yeah.
So basically, Nick's saying that there's been a shift. He says that the Charlie Hebdo shooting was pure theatre. Nobody died. They just used blank firing rounds. There was no blood. There was no death certificates. And Nick says that no one died, and anyone that claimed to have died is probably off in South America somewhere. I think that's where Richard starts to get the inkling of his theory that people were moved abroad, because that's the first mention of it in Rich Planet that I can see. Nick also says that the shooting at the Bataclan, where the Eagles of Death Metal were playing, was also fake and no one died. And his main evidence is that you don't see any dead bodies or pictures of anybody wounded. That's not true. If you Google Bataclan shooting right now, you'll see the very famous shooting of the dance floor with a huge amount of gore on there. It doesn't take a lot of clicking to find some really graphic stuff from the Bataclan shooting, which is means that Nick doesn't know what he's talking about. He also thinks that the Eagles of Death Metal are a death metal band, which is a very minor point, but it just goes to show that he's not particularly good on details. But anyway, Richard says,
people would say, well, the media have censored that because they
and
don't
what you
want to
do
show
get is
anything.
very dramatic reports of white killers, white SAS type killers with guns. I mean, you get reports of suicide bombers. Media keep saying suicide bombers, but there's no sign of any suicide bomber.
a couple of things to unpack there. One, why on earth is Nick so concerned about white people in that regard? I think that's giving a hint of his potential internal prejudices. You know, the types that make him deny the Holocaust, those ones. And also, it's interesting that Richard starts to say people would say that the media have censored that because, and Nick cuts him off. Now, I don't think that Nick's being desperately sophisticated there. I think he's just trying to get his argument in. But I don't think he's being sort of like, crafty or anything. But what is interesting is that Richard doesn't actually go back to that. Richard was about to push back and say, hang on, there's reasons that wouldn't happen. And that's memory hold. That's totally memory hold. And he's starting to sort of go along with it. And at that point, Richard has an epiphany and he talks about how, if there's a suicide bomber, then there's no trial because the perpetrator is dead, which would allow the authorities to disguise and conceal what really happened. And he says that is the ideal tool to use in a fabricated event because then there is no trial. I mean, that's not strictly true. There is a trial and there is an inquiry and stuff like that. But I take his point that basically if the main suspect is dead, that it's very difficult for them to argue against that. I mean, it's not impossible, but fair enough. But again, you can see the seed of Richard starting to build this concept of how fake fabricated terror is done. Like, you never see enough blood. There's some use of twos involved. There's fakery because of reasons. Crisis actors is a thing. And maybe they're sending people to South America or something like that. Now, this is fascinating. Richard says, and this might come back to bite him.
One thing I think we need to be careful of, Nick, is almost everything that you've mentioned there with regards your perception of what happened at these events has been gleaned from mainstream media reports. And people in the alternative media or the independent media tend to get those reports and try and see flaws, or they, like you mentioned, the bullet didn't really go in the guy's head and it went past him. Right. So where have you got that from? You've got it from a mainstream news report. Now, I think the mainstream are very careful what they put out, and even to the point where I think they know there's a small percentage of people don't buy any of these terror events, and they know that people like you are going to try and analyse them. So they possibly plant things in there to mislead you, so that you get the wrong end of the stick with your theory.
So we can still see that Richard at this point is basically saying, I don't actually agree with you, Nick, but here's a plausible reason within our milieu why you might not be an idiot. it might be a double bluff. You might be being conned. And Richard suggests to Nick Colostrom that due to this possibility, the best thing to do is to speak to first-hand witnesses. So interesting, what Richard's saying at this point in time is just looking at pictures and forming an opinion of them really isn't evidence. It really isn't good enough, which is odd because that would be the mainstay of his entire thesis. But let's not get bogged down. Richard then makes this statement, which is ironic.
The advice I would give for someone who does want to pick up a camera and go to one of these fabricated events and try and get their own evidence is be extremely polite and courteous, because we've got the example of, I think it was in Sandy Hook, where there's a guy who was trying to get evidence. He didn't believe that some of the families had their children had been killed, and I think he's been put on trial for upsetting those parents in Sandy Hook. Have you heard that? That there's a guy actually been put on trial because he's been trying to do an independent investigation.
All right.
Now, Richard would not heed that advice, and as we well know, many years later, he would film or try to film and successfully film a teenage girl because he wanted to prove that she wasn't really disabled by the result of a bomb blast. Anyway, fascinating to see how much he's changed. Now, Nick responds by saying that no children died at Sandy Hook, and Richard says that maybe the idea of the hoax is spun by the media to entrap researchers, but Nick says that that's probably far too complicated, which means that he doesn't understand it. But Nick thinks that Sandy Hook is fake and that no murders were recorded by the FBI in Newton that year. All right, so this is the entire reason that Nick thinks that Sandy Hook was fake. There was a page put out by the FBI that basically said the number of murders that year, and it didn't include, suspiciously according to the conspiracy crowd, the children that were killed at Sandy Hook. So according to the official FBI documents, no children were killed in Sandy Hook. Case closed. Except for the asterisk and the caveat at the bottom of the page that says that the victims from the recent tragedy at Newtown had not been included in this. They'd been included in a wider, I believe it was a state document. So they'd been recorded somewhere else. It says on the document that Nick presents as evidence why he's wrong about it. But this is still one of the sort of the main sort of bits of evidence that Sandy Hook was fake. Then in the final third of this particular program, Nick spends the entire time explaining that Auschwitz was actually a really nice place to live.
So shall we talk a little bit about what we've covered so far?
Yeah.
Before we go too far back, I want to talk about something that he says at the very beginning of this. On 1st of July 2016, that's the section that we've just finished, and it says, people claim that in some of the more recent terror attacks, due to the lack of evidence of blood, and because the witness and family are not reacting as expected, that there is little evidence that anyone has died. And I would say that that's not any evidence that no one has died. It's something that you have decided is an anomaly to the mainstream narrative, but it actually isn't any evidence of the other thing that you're pushing. So I just wanted to pick up on that because I thought that was fucking weird. And I also find the fact that we've encountered 2 Holocaust deniers already. Yeah.
It does seem to run through some of this like like a name through a stick of rock. But yeah, I was actually very surprised to find out that Nick was a Holocaust denier. But
4 years before he got on to Rich Planet.
That's what concerns me, is that Richard's like, nah, it's fine. And it's like, right, okay, but it's not though, is it?
I find it like really difficult to handle because like my grandfather, who's hanging on by a thread, he's my sort of step grandfather, but like, he sort of married my birth grandmother. He's Polish. He was in concentration camps. I'm not sure which ones. Very difficult situation to bring up. He did flee, wound up getting double done in a Siberian one. Great. I don't remember him saying it being a nice time.
No.
He has night terrors, which still plague him to this date. He watched his family die in front of him. He fled to New Zealand and came to Australia, which I would say is a good choice. But, look, rugby players would be totally saying otherwise. And it's just insane when you hear this sort of stuff. It's not that being personally affected or involved really means that much, especially now that there's a handful of people from the Holocaust who are still alive. But whenever I hear this shit of the fucking Holocaust, blah, blah, it annoys me. When I hear the idea that places like Auschwitz were a fucking a summer camp, my grandpa Frank, or Marion, who doesn't know his birthday because he was too young to know when he was born, and he was basically just thrown to concentration camps from a fucking infant. I can't go there, man. Fuck this.
The thing that really gets on my nerves about the whole thing is that the tropes that they use have been successfully debunked time and time and time again. His talk of the pool, there was this, I think it was like a water filtration bit. It's like a mini reservoir. The inmates weren't allowed to swim in that. There's some photos of guards swimming in it. Right, okay. The best book on the subject, and there's lots of really good books, but Deborah Lipstadt's Denying the Holocaust is fascinating because what it does is it looks at each of these tropes and it looks to the source of these tropes and looks who was the first person to say it, when did they say it, and when you find that out and find, well, these people have got a vested interest in Nazi Germany or whatever, it's very obvious why this is a lie and why this person was telling this lie. And that's the thing that I find so annoying. And I hate to say this, but this isn't the last mention of Holocaust denial that we're going to have. So, it's...
I was ready to be upset today. Yeah, I mean, I didn't walk into this thinking it was going to be a cakewalk. I was expecting dead children, fuckwits, and general horror. So bring it on, my friend.
The other thing is I would like to share my kind of experience here. All these events that you're talking about, I remember myself disagreeing with the hoaxer narrative. And it, like you said, starts with Sandy Hook, then it goes to Boston Marathon bombing, the Pulse nightclub shooting, the Paris and Nice attacks, and all of this. And Lee Rigby as well. And I remember having a conversation with a real life friend, one of our friends who was a conspiracist. He had posted a few videos about Sandy Hook, about some of the family pictures being photoshopped and that, because he was a graphic designer, and he was right. And it did come out that some of them were photoshopped, but it's because if you got a picture of a bunch of kids, you have to kind of you have to superimpose some of them onto each other because one kid's looking that way, the other kid's looking that way, and that's all that it was, right?
Yeah.
But I had a conversation with him about the Lee Rigby murder. And obviously my whole thing was that these people were murdered for sacrifices, and it was supposed to shock us and put spells, etc. over us. And he was like, no, look, the blood is fake. The blood is fake on the knife. Look, you see the color on the Sun newspaper or whatever. You see the color of the blood on the knife. That's just not the color of blood. It's darker. And I went, yeah, but you can also tell by everything else that they've boosted the contrast here.
Yeah.
Yeah. To make the red blood stick out. That's what you can see it from the rest of the picture. And he just wouldn't have it because he was like, no, it's fake. And I wouldn't have it because I thought, no, these people are murdered for that reason. But it is really, really strange, hearing you go through all these different points and me remembering, oh yeah, I remember when that happened, and I remember these conversations I had with people, and how it kept reinforcing to me that these hoax narratives are bullshit. I don't agree with any of you.
Yeah.
I find that part very
I have a somewhat embarrassing confession because I the same thing. When the Lee Rigby came out, people were saying it's fake because of X, Y, and Z. So I wrote a blog, first blog I'd ever written, pointing out why it wasn't fake and why they'd misinterpreted the pictures, contrast, etc., etc. And you know who I sent it to?
Go on.
Paul Joseph Watts. And he sent it back and said it was really good, and that I was
good,
really proud.
Oh, that's great. Oh man, that is very cringe. Maybe he'll be press secretary of the US soon. That'd be great.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, so, but the main point is we can see that basically actually Richard is still not on board with hoaxes. He's definitely Nick Collestrom's bag, but Nick has got it from Jim Fetzer. And Jim Fetzer was the person that ultimately led to Alex Jones and Wolfgang Halbig and all of that sort of thing. So it's fascinating to see that Jim Fetzer's like that monkey in Outbreak. He's patient zero. Like he's spread this madness out throughout people that's ultimately hurt a lot of people.
What I can say is that movie is great, and you all should watch Outbreak immediately. Dustin Hoffman, come on, great film. That's all I'm saying.
And I guess if you don't get the joke, we can update it and say he's the pangolin.
Yes, there you go. He's the pangolin.